My name is Olin Wethington. I have the privilege of serving on the board of Freedom House and also the privilege of introducing our luncheon speaker today, Senator Gordon Smith, who is president and CEO of the National Association of Broadcasters. As you know, its focus is on television and radio broadcasting. We have the privilege today of hearing Senator Smith speak on issues of free speech and First Amendment, which are central issues to the NAB. As you may also know, the NAB has a very active program in support of the central mission of free speech. They're one of the sponsors, for example, of the National Free Speech Week. It is a very active student scholarship program through its NAB Foundation. And it is a big supporter of airing public service broadcast programs supportive of free speech. Senator Smith has a distinguished career, as I know you know, in the U.S. Senate, where he served as two-term senator from the good state of Oregon. I didn't tell you a while ago, I've had the privilege of going out there several times in the last couple of months, and it is absolutely one of the most scenic, spectacular states in our country. He was on the committee of the Senate Commerce Committee, Senate Energy Committee, Senate Finance Committee, and Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, where he was a very strong supporter of human rights, democracy, equality. So we're very pleased to have you here today, Senator, and I give you this podium. Thank you for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here with you to speak on what I think most of you would regard, because you're here, as really a central issue around having a democracy and enjoying freedom. I understand that my former colleague and my friend still Ben Cardin was with you this morning. And as we were discussing before coming in here with your leadership, sometimes lost in all the cacophony coming from Capitol Hill, the fighting over this budget or that policy, we sometimes don't stop to remember the things that we don't fight about up there, like freedom of speech, central issues that are key to our freedoms that we enjoy so liberally and abundantly in the United States of America. I come to this city, to politics and my interest in public affairs sort of born to the battle. Born in Oregon. When I was 2 years old, my father accepted a job to work for Dwight Eisenhower. And my mother's last name or maiden name is Udall. And some of you may know there's a few Udalls in this town. They're all my cousins. Well, we have a family saying in the Udall family at reunions, it's often said there are more Udalls in Arizona than U-Alls in Texas. So when you are the offspring of a Udall mother, you are schooled in the ethic of giving back, of giving service, of being involved in trying to make the world a better place. When my political career ended and some of my cousins continued in the Senate or House, I felt very privileged to be hired by the National Association of Broadcasters to be their CEO, because the heart of broadcasting is the heart of a public servant. Because what broadcasters do as their piece of media freedom is to focus on localism, to focus on news, to focus on getting to the public the kind of information they have to be entertained, to be informed, to be warned, and to be kept free, to be civically literate so that our democracy can be healthy. So in the NAB, we have all the giant networks, all of them, Fox, CBS, ABC, NBC, Univision. They're all members and all of their affiliates throughout this country. What's interesting about the way our technology is organized different here than in Europe, for example, is if you are living in Manchester, England, you will get the national news. If you live in Manchester, New Hampshire, you'll get news of Manchester, New Hampshire. And this is distributed through affiliates. But we go from those large companies down to the smallest mom and pop AM station in rural America. But all of them have at their core to inform their local citizens and to make a living. And they make a living by disseminating the facts as impartially as they can, and then try to feed their families and pay their debts and their mortgages and you name it. But localism can be very different. It may be that a talk show in New York City actually may not get much of an audience in Salt Lake City. The news in Portland, Maine is different than that in Portland, Oregon. But all of it is focused on what appeals to people locally. So I'm very proud to be a broadcaster because it is part and parcel of the ethic my mother and father passed on to me of being involved in public service. And when I think about broadcasting and its role, its cornerstone role, is in relationship to the First Amendment, the Constitution, the freedom of expression, because on that fundamental human right hang all the other rights and blessings that we enjoy. So sometimes it is well in places like this to step back and to think a little bit about where does this all come from? It comes from the Age of Enlightenment. It comes from great thinkers and policymakers like Edmund Burke of England. During the American Revolution, he was a conservative, defined as a conservative in his time, who tended to be actually quite radical against the policies of King George III as it related to the American revolutionaries. And during that time, as was reported by the historian Carlyle, there was allowed to be a press room in Parliament. And Carlyle reported what Burke said, and I think it's very interesting. He said from the floor that there are 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporter's gallery yonder, and he pointed there sits a 4th estate, more important far than they all. Now, the first 3 estates he would have been talking about would have been the Lord's spiritual, the Lord's temporal, and the commons. Now, if you want to translate that from the unwritten Constitution of England to the United States Constitution, it would be the Congress, the President, and the courts, the legislative, the executive, and judicial functions of a king translated to how we, the people, govern ourselves. But the glue in all of it to keep it working is obviously the 4th estate. Not the president, not the Congress, not the courts, but the freedom of the press to actually report on the facts and inform the public so that if things aren't going right, the public then has the freedom to change its government. That's why Burke said, more important by far than they all. So I think that's a fabulous little piece of history. And when you think about how this was grafted into the American experience, when the Constitutional Convention first met, they were charged with reforming the Articles of Confederation. And essentially, they went way beyond their mandate. And they came up with a constitutional government that separated the powers of the king into three different estates. But they didn't have any guarantee of the press. And so when the first Congress met, it came up with 10 amendments, which we call now the Bill of Rights. And the first of those is what you're meeting about here. And I would suggest to you the First Amendment to the Constitution is America's greatest export, its greatest blessing in all of our commerce and our culture, our military power, our diplomatic soft power. Our greatest export is the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. On that hangs all of our freedoms. Now, one of the things I have tried to do since coming to NAB is to export what we know as American broadcasters, to share it internationally. And as a consequence, we have re-upped and re-engaged with international broadcasting associations around the world. And the International Broadcasters Association, which is really a South American broadcasting organization, asked me to come to Montevideo, Uruguay, to be their keynote speaker. I went down there to share with them sort of an update on U.S. spectrum policy and ownership restrictions, things like that. But when I got there, I was met at the airport, and I said to my host, I said, "This is what I've planned. What do you think?" And he said, actually, we would really like you to talk about the broadcaster's role in preserving freedom of speech. And I was frankly kind of astonished by that. I said, what are you talking about? Freedom of speech? You certainly have freedom of speech. And he said, well, we do, but it hangs by a thread. And in many of our countries in the South American Broadcasting Association, we're one election away from losing it. I thought, my heavens, so we're going down to first principles again. Something we take for granted in the United States, that we'll have freedom of the press, freedom of speech, is something that they were more concerned about than what kind of sharing of spectrum exists between the telephone companies and the broadcasters. And so I thought about how to speak about this central, pivotal freedom. And it came to me when I was given a tour before the beginning of the conference of the old city of Montevideo. Montevideo was settled over 400 years ago by the Spanish. And at the entrance to old Montevideo town is an ancient stone gate. It has stood there for 400 years. It was built by the Spanish. And I thought, as I looked on it, how has that gate survived all this time? And in the middle of that gate is an ancient keystone. And I thought, that's the theme, the keystone. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech is the keystone in the arch of our freedoms. And if you pull that out, all the rest of it comes down and would be in ruins along with everything else the Spanish did there, except for that gate and that keystone. So that was my metaphor in my speaking to them, that if they wanted to take seriously their job in the media and as broadcasters, they would courageously defend freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Once they lose that, it's the first thing dictators go after, by the way. Then all their other freedoms are hostage to the whim and caprice of tyrants. Now, recently I was asked by the Chinese government to bring a version of the NAB show. I don't know if you know what the NAB show is, but every year we have a trade show in Los Angeles, or in Las Vegas. It's probably the second or third largest trade show in the world. Over 100,000 people come to it, and it focuses on broadcasting, media, digital, content. All these people come every year to the NAB show in April in Las Vegas. And we have a large international body of visitors come, and the Chinese began to come in great numbers. And their delegation asked me if we would bring a version of the NAB show to Shanghai. And if we would do that, we would have the full cooperation of the Chinese government. And we thought to ourselves, it might be a good economic opportunity. There's 1 billion people over there. And maybe we have something to share, and maybe it would not be just a drain. So we took a version of this last December to Shanghai, to a beautiful exposition hall there. And because the Chinese government was supporting this, they sent a delegation down from Beijing. And when you meet with Chinese dignitaries, you sit in a horseshoe-shaped fashion, and you sit next to the highest minister. I had done this as a U.S. Senator, and I was doing it now as NAB CEO. And we had a delightful visit, and they were very appreciative that we would come and bring to their shores something that was so successful in our country. But then he asked me a question that actually kind of haunts me. He asked me the question, what are you doing in America to control the internet? And I said, well, we don't control it. And the best antidote for bad things on the internet is to flood it with good things. And freedom will flood it better than you can centrally plan it. And he was just astonished at that. He said, you can't allow this stuff to go over the internet. Some of it's terrible. And I said, yeah, it is. I don't want my kids to see it either. But what I want is the freedom for my people to be able to express themselves. And ultimately, our belief in history is the proof that if you follow bad information, flooding it with good information, the truth will ultimately out. Well, we didn't end up agreeing on that point. But to my earlier point, all of the freedoms we enjoy in America, to go to church where you want to go, to support the candidate of your choice in an election, to do everything you do, ladies and gentlemen, everything you do, even driving home tonight, has constitutional implications. Everything. Your safety against intrusion by the police, for example, or your ability to write a letter to the editor, or to meet peacefully in your home without government intrusion with your family, your freedom to go and engage in commerce, in the commerce of your choosing. All of that is ultimately contingent upon the sacred right of freedom of expression, press, speech, association, assembly. So all that we do in this country every day has constitutional implications, but they're all hostage to the First Amendment. Well, they don't get that in China, and we agreed to disagree about the best way to deal with the internet. Now, finally, I told you my mother's name was Udall. One of my cousins, Morris Udall, used to be a very prominent congressman in this town. He ran for president against Jimmy Carter on the Democratic side. He wrote a book. And in the first page of that book, he marveled that in the United States, every young boy or girl can grow up to be president of the United States. But he said, actually, that's not the biggest marvel. The biggest genius of this country is that every boy or girl can grow up making fun of the president of the United States. And that's the real test. That's the real acid test of freedom. I think it's a brilliant insight that he made, and which I wholeheartedly endorse. Now, finally, we're in the middle of an election season, and as in war, sometimes the first casualty in political campaigns is the truth. But the way to solve the lack of truth or to counter the talking points is with other talking points. I've been in 5 different elections, none of them easy, but ultimately our democracy works. Now, a member of your Freedom House is a good friend of mine from Oregon. This is a speech I gave to a law society at the Ronald Reagan Museum many years ago when I was in the Senate. And I ended this speech by referring to one of my dear friends, Golia Mary, who I believe is on the board here. I'm sorry she's not here. She's just a lovely, marvelous, wonderful person. And I count her among my dearest friends. Sometimes we get in these political campaigns and we think all is lost. We don't like our choices and the government is in jeopardy. I'm here to suggest to you that the wisdom, the inspiration of our founders from the Enlightenment will keep us safe as long as we protect the First Amendment and the freedom of speech and media. I concluded this talk with the following, and it gets to Golia Mary, a story that I will conclude with. The House Watergate hearings and the Senate trial of President Clinton were moments of great political drama. I participated in one and certainly remember the other as a younger man. After President Nixon's resignation, the world wondered if we in America were coming apart. A member of Congress calmed the concerns of visitors from Greece, citizens from democracy's birthplace, saying, "Do not underestimate the strength of the American democracy. The commander-in-chief of the American Armed Forces was forced out of office, and not one soldier left the barracks to defend him." Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is the rule of law. And the rule of law depends on freedom of speech. And freedom of speech happens in great abundance on Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill, Congress works well sometimes and not so well other times, but one thing reigns and one thing is not debated, and that's the freedom of debate. It all happens in the Capitol building, a building that sits 1 mile east and 88 feet above the Potomac River, what was once called Jenkins Hill. The Capitol building was designed by an Englishman. It was inspired by a Russian church and decorated by Italian craftsmen. Now, what could be more American than that? It is as close a thing as we have to a national temple, and it may be the most recognizable building on earth. A glimpse of the Capitol building fills me then and still with feelings of awe and appreciation, just as it did when I was an 8-year-old boy and attended with my parents the inauguration of John F. Kennedy. So let me say that it's fashionable, even fun, to criticize the Congress. I have done it for years. The fact is, however, that however imperfect Congress is, it ultimately works. But it was designed to work inefficiently, and it is succeeding. It is worth remembering When the first Congress met in 1789, kings still ruled in France and England. A sultan reigned in Constantinople. A czar terrorized the Russians. A shogun dominated Japan. And a divinely invested emperor sat enthroned over China. Now, all of those forms of government have passed into history books, but the Congress and American democracy continue because we're doing one thing right. We're defending and exporting the First Amendment. Now, I don't want to be accused of filibustering here, but I want to leave you tonight with a question and a story about Golia Mary. The question was put to me by Golia Mary, who is an American-Iranian woman whose family escaped with their lives from the Islamic Revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini. A Senate page came to me and gave me a note informing me that a large group of women from Oregon were waiting for me in the Senate lobby. I knew that these women were supporters of mine who had come to Washington on something of a frolic. Golia Mary was among them. I believe it may have been her first visit to Washington, D.C. As I visited with them in the Senate lobby, I noticed Golia looking about somewhat wistfully. And so as our Q&A exchange ended, I approached Golia and asked her, "So what do you think?" Her response I will never forget. She said, "I'm just wondering, Senator, if the American people appreciate the miracle of it all." The answer to her question, I leave to each of you as individual citizens of this country and as people who understand and are willing to defend the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Thank you very much. Want me to? I may have gone too long.
No, you didn't go too long. Would like to keep you for just a couple of minutes if we could, but let me thank you for what were really very clear and eloquent, and I would say inspirational remarks focused on fundamental values. And I personally appreciated your many historical references as well as contemporary anecdotes. But I was struck very much by your statement that our number one export are our values, First Amendment values. And to pose a contemporary question, one that I hope the next administration, regardless of which party it is, will face, is what should, in what I think we might all agree has been in recent years a decline in appreciation on the part of many governments throughout the world for fundamental freedoms like press and speech, what should the next administration do to elevate that in their consciousness? What one or two things might you make brief reference to?
Well, if it's President Trump, I'd tell him not to change the libel laws. I'd encourage him to read New York Times versus Sullivan. If it is my former colleague, Senator Clinton, I would have her champion our best export all over the globe. But I kind of go back to where I started. They're debating a lot of stuff up there, but they're not debating freedom of speech. And everyone in public office with the ability to make a difference needs to be talking about this central value wherever they go and in whatever they do. And because it is the greatest threat to tyrants and tyranny is that freedom that keeps the people informed and thereby empowered to do something with facts. That's why far more important than all the other estates in government is the one sitting up yonder in the press box.
Two very brief questions. American. Hi, I'm a Chinese American human rights activist in DC, and I recently had among the activists met with the National Security Advisor, Ms. Rice, and I said that if you scrape off the bare surface of all of our problems with China, you will actually find human rights and freedom is at the center of every problem. And so, what will you advise the next president in Americans dealing with China?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I will tell you, I was in the Senate from 96 to 2009, and I voted for every engagement we could possibly have with China, and proud to say even on trade agreements. Part of the reason I did that was my belief that Chinese are no different than any other human being, and that more exposure to us and to our greatest exports will ultimately take what came out of Tiananmen Square, which was an agreement unofficial between China's government and China's people. At least this is how I interpreted it. We will give you economic freedom as long as you preserve our political monopoly as the Communist Party. And therefore they take the right to regulate speech. I believe that economic freedom would ultimately translate into more political freedom in China. It's taken longer than I thought, but China has a long patience, and China's culture is much more group-oriented than individualistic. I think I'm right in saying that. But ultimately, China will not be able to control a political monopoly for communism as long as people get more and more freedom, which is why this Chinese minister asked me as the CEO of NAB if I had any ideas for how to better control the internet. And the answer is you can't control the internet unless you're willing to take freedom from your people. So I would tell Secretary Clinton or Donald Trump that in the end, engagement is enormously important. And in the end, it is on the right side of history. So I believe we need to stay engaged with China because people who do business together don't go to war against one another. And I think it's very important that China and the United States have as much open dialogue as possible, that we continue to push this central value and engage with them as best we are able. Does that help? Because I don't know how to force them into our values, but ultimately we have to stay at it.
Senator, we want to be respectful of your time. Let me just say for our audience here, Golia Mary, as you know,
yes,
was the person that opened the door to conversation between our two organizations. And we're grateful for that. And let me say personally, but I know I reflect the views of Freedom House more generally. We hope that this is the beginning of significant collaboration going forward. We have so much in common.
Thank you very much, everybody.